been stuck on firmware 36.38 on my Motion Plus. Yes, it's still relevant today. Former pound for pound world champion till it was dethroned by the Motion Boom. Still got a place to play. I am stuck on firmware 36.38. You're telling me there's firmware 37.38. What the difference is, I don't know. I thought maybe eventually they're going to bring the update to my... This is one of the original Motion Plus speakers. Waiting for the update. It's not coming, so I've been forced. I've had to do it against my will. I was pulled and pulled to get a modern version of the Motion Plus. Two reasons. So I know it's going to come with firmware 37.38. I can see if there's any differences. Also wondered, is there any differences anyway between having one of the earlier versions to a new modern version? Obviously, quality control, all that, the parts, the virus and everything has come along. The parts are never going to be exactly the same as they were, you know, when they first started producing it. The first thing I did, to be honest, I weighed it. Weighed my first one and the newest one, and to the actual gram, they weigh exactly the same. So all I know is I've got two speakers, two different firmware versions. I want to know if they are tuned in any way different or they just happen to be different. Bassup is a default mode. I've done a frequency response comparing the two, 80%, 100%, Bassup default mode. My new Motion Plus on firmware 37.38 appears to have more highs peaking around just under 3 kilohertz, possibly some deeper bass. We're hitting around 50 hertz. One thing's for sure, it appears something is very different between these two speakers. So what's going on? I can measure a difference between my two versions. Is that because that's just speaker variation? Is it because there are some differences between the actual versions? Is it because this one's blue? I don't know. I have to say, so many of the Soundcore speakers come in black. It is nice to have one in a colour. Makes no difference to the sound, I don't think, although there are differences here. But yeah, I feel happier having the blue one in my hand. Is that a bit silly? Yep, it probably is. So I've measured the difference. There's, you know, at least a decibel difference in bass, upper bass, and around that 2.53 kilohertz region. Enough of a difference to say that's beyond some margin of error. Of course there's going to be a margin of error. Just moving anything slightly when you're taking these measurements can have a difference. But that's a real difference. I can measure a difference, but can we hear a difference? This is Bassup default mode between these two speakers.
Best thing I ever seen, center of attention, the cover of a magazine, picture perfect body, like something from a movie scene. I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm on the edge of my seat.
So pretty much confirming what we saw on the frequency response, firmware 37.38 for me has some deeper bass, and you can quite clearly see that. So we got like a double peak here in the bass on the 37.38, around 70 hertz and then 60 hertz. 36.38, that second peak completely missing. It's already starting to roll off at the first peak. So that's a real difference between the two firmwares, and the newer firmware is a half a decibel louder thanks to a bit more in the highs. And if I switch new, old, you can probably see around this high end, there's more highs on the newer firmware. And that's in default tuning for both of them. So there's definitely a difference between these two speakers. Now, I don't know if you're going to have the same differences. I can only tell you, for whatever reason, I have a difference between my two speakers. On the newest version, my blue 37.38, It does have a deeper bass, but there's more upper bass and more lower mids on the older version, 36.38. And I've got a bit more in the around that 3 kilohertz region. Quite honestly, could have done without that, because although we do like the detail on the Motion Plus, it can be a little grating on the ear. Yeah, especially if you use my custom EQ. Fair enough. However, the thing here I'm asking myself is, there is a difference. You can measure it, no matter whether I measure it in a track itself or a frequency response. There's definitely something going on, and you can hear the difference. But why is the older version stuck on 36.38? So is there actually some hardware differences? Are the drivers different? I don't know. There must be something going on that they can't upgrade the firmware, I assume. I don't know. But how would you explain that we're not getting an upgrade on the older versions, 36.38, but the new ones come with a different version, 37.38, seems to have a deeper bass, seems to sound a little bit different. But hey ho, it was also a little bit more screechy sounding because it's gone overboard again in that the region we are particularly sensitive, around that 3 kilohertz region. And there's enough of a difference for me to say, you know, once I got the Motion Boom and I got used to that deep bass, it's hard to go back to the Motion Plus, because that deep bass makes such a difference in most tracks for me. So coming back to the Motion Plus now, the fact that it's gone even more overboard in terms of this kind of edging on screechiness because of that extra, the combination of less upper bass, although there is a bit more deep bass, and more at 3 kilohertz, makes it to me a little bit more screechy. So for two reasons: A, it does seem a bit more high and slanted, and because I now really need a bit more of a fuller bass or a more dominant bass. So I've changed my EQ. So new EQ on my Blue 37.38, which does favour a fuller bass, and I'm using the old EQ that I did have on 37.38, which is clearly more sparkly, but can be especially as you go up in volume, can get a bit too edgy for some people. But it's quite aggressive and quite an attack sounding kind of signature, which I did personally like. But yeah, I'm really missing the low end slam, and the screechiness is more noticeable because I'm coming from something like the Motion Boom. Most often when I'm switching between speakers, it will be the Motion Boom, and then I've gone on to something else. So tuning to how my ears now would like to hear the Motion Plus, which means a smoother sound, less of that sparkliness and that edginess, and a bit more dominant, fuller sounding bass because of that. So this is my quick test sample, my comparison. Old EQ 36.38, my new EQ 37.38.
You talk too much shit, but don't back it up. Shoot on deck if you're trying to get bagged up. It's broken boy, bitch, I don't need to throw rags up. I put that on my mama. Hot tech sipping, got me sweating like a sauna. Acting like a bitch when you fuck with the drama. It's only 2 pops, little but then you were gonna. Yeah, broken, goated up. Pop my cape and run it up. Make that bag, I'ma give it to my mom. At the end of the day, that's the only one I got. She's holding up a gun to the codeine. Shawty said she know me, she don't know me. Limousine riding, pulled up in a Corvette, that's a perfect with the diet. She say she love me, but I know the bitch rolling up a pine to the codeine. Shawty said she know me, she don't know me. Limousine riding, pulled up in a Corvette, that's a perfect with the diet. She say she love me, but I know the bitch lying. Heavyweight, yeah, big body, Lexus, Bentley, ex-bitch want me. Heavyweight, yeah, big body, Lexus, Bentley, ex-bitch want me. Hey, little pump boy, get this big. I ran it up, bitch, I'm Canadian, I'm good with the sticks. I'm 5'5", a little boy, still a midget to me. It's cause I'm money shit, little bitch, I made it to the big league, yeah. Broken, goated up, pop my cape and run it up. Make that bag, I'ma give it to my mom. At the end of the day, that's the only one I got. She's holding up a gun to the codeine. Shawty said she know me, she don't know me. Limousine riding, pulled up in a Corvette, that's a perfect with the diet. She say she love me, but I know the bitch rolling up a pine to the codeine. Shawty said she know me, she don't know me. Limousine riding, pulled up in a Corvette, that's a perfect with the diet. She say she love me, but I know the bitch lying.
So I've tuned the Firmware 27.38 to sound a bit more bass prominent, and indeed, like for like, in terms of volume, we've got 4 decibels more now in the actual deep bass. And despite the 150 Hz and 300 Hz sliders being the same, Firmware 26.38 does have a tad more in mid bass and upper bass. I've also tamed some of that added high end now on the Firmware 27.38. It does leave the 26.38 sounding a bit more sparkly. It does have a little bit more in the mids at this volume, but for me, 27.38 sounds smoother, and I do think I'm preferring that difference in the sound now. So it's a smoother sound, my new EQ on the... Look, you may just want to leave it in bass up. I'm not saying use my EQ. I'm not saying there's anything magic, but a lot of you seem to be interested in how I personally EQ my speakers for my ears. This is how I'm now applying my Motion Plus. I do quite like this particular tuning. It's bringing out the bass. There is more deep bass on this anyway, but I've also adjusted for the fact that we lost a bit of upper bass. So it's got more bass everywhere now because we're taming back those highs, and that's the benefit of doing that. So the big difference between the two, certainly it's more mids first you will hear on my old EQ, and a more sparkly, but also can be a bit edgy depending, if you're going for bright tracks. A much smoother sound, which over going across genres, to me, is a more friendly listen. Certainly has certainly brought out the bass. I do personally like that tuning, but I could understand someone saying, you've lost the sparkle on the whole point. But no, the detail's still there. We've still got the tweeters. It's still a nice spread of sound. And to me, it still retains what was the strengths of the Motion Plus. So I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but we only want to know, how does it sound against your pound-for-pound world champion? The Soundcore Motion Boom. There's only one way to find out. We'll have a listen.
So I chain myself to find some more again. It didn't matter what they wanted to say. He thought he saw someone that looked just like me. There's some memory that just never dies. We worked too long and hard to give it no time. But there's a lonely stars hiding in the cold. Take it, I don't wanna sing anymore. I listen to your problems, now listen to mine. I didn't want to anymore. Oh, and we will never be alone again, 'cause it doesn't happen every day. Kinda count on you being a friend. Can I give it up or give it away? Now I thought I would wanna stay, but I never really know where to go. So I chained myself to a friend, 'cause I know when I locked like a door. And we will never be alone again, 'cause it doesn't happen every day. Kinda count on you being a friend. Can I give it up or give it away? Now I thought I would wanna stay, but I never really know where to go. So I chained myself to a friend. Some more kids don't understand. Don't care what I say. I'm not with you. Whisper me around. It's all I do when I'm with you.
So you don't need your mum to tell you, even against me new EQ, it's simply got a deeper bass. It simply goes places in the bass that the Motion Plus can only ever dream of. So, and that's what it's all about. But hey ho, we've still got more detail and a bigger, open, more open, detailed sound. I'm not going to say brighter because my tuning does bring out the brilliance end, which is the best way I found to get more clarity out of the Motion Boom. So that a lot of the highs are coming from the brilliance region, which for some people may not suit their ears, and for some people might not even hear it. Still has a place. I do quite like the new I do the way I've now tuned it. I personally quite like my Motion Plus. I have kind of reinvented it in terms of a place amongst all my speakers. I am listening to it more now with this tuning than I was recently doing with the old tuning. But the differences are obvious. You've got detail, you've got still some sparkle and an open sound, and it's really good off axis, which the Motion Boom is not good. It's clearly much better on axis. But that deep bass, you can't get away from it. That it's so damn satisfying that it's hard to listen to the same tracks because you're missing so much of that track. you know, because there is no real deep bass. I was, you know, almost from like 60 hertz down. You're not going to hear that stuff in the same way as you're going to hear this, which goes almost not rolled off at down to 40 hertz. So, new EQ, I think 37.38 with this EQ, if that's why they sound different. Of course, we don't know how much of it is speaker variation. But personally, I do like my blue version now with my new EQ. I am listening to it more than I had been before, but it's can't match. It's not going to dethrone the new pound for pound world champion, the Soundcore Motion Boom, unless it's going to go massively louder. So what do you think is going to happen? A maximum of volume test. If it's all about loudness, you're still going to prefer the old version 36.38 with old tuning, whatever tuning you happen to use. Although we do have a smoother sound, if it's all about volume, this does go, you know, noticeably louder because of that high-end kick, which I personally find a bit grating on the ears. So I still prefer the smoother sound, although it doesn't go as loud on the new version 37.38, but they can't touch. Look, it's still the loudest. It goes the deepest in the bass. It goes the loudest. It's the most present when you're going to maximum volumes, even though, you know, all three of them are limiting the bass from 80%. When you're hitting maximum volume, you're going to be able to sit a lot further away from that outdoors than you will with the Motion Plus, because it's simply clearer, going louder, it's got more bass. That's not to say any of them are particularly a great listen at maximum volume, but if volume is what it's all about, it's a win for the Motion Boom. At low volumes, it's a win with the deep bass, but it still has a place. It can kick a reasonable bass. It's got tweeters. It's also got aptX, not to forget, where that's SBC. So it's got a better codec on the Motion Plus. We don't have an auxiliary input on the Motion Boom. That's something to note. And we do have an auxiliary input on the Soundcore Motion Plus. That's something to note. They all do stereo pairing. And by the way, on paper, if you're wondering, it goes louder, but they are all rated 30 watts on paper. 1.5 kilos Motion Boom, 1 kilo the Soundcore Motion Plus. What's the takeaway of this video? Ow! Well, the takeaway is check the firmware. It may be that 37.38 simply is tuned different, or the hardware is different, or, you know, unless I had another one to test again, I can't say for sure that's different tuning, different hardware, or just speaker variation. I can only tell you, for me, I am preferring because it does go a little bit deeper anyway on this 37.38 version, and with my newer tuning, brings out more of that bass, smoothed out of the high end. For me personally, I found this, I am enjoying this more now than the older Motion Plus, but can't touch the Motion Boom. But hey ho, I'll probably flip-flop between them more than I was before, because it's going to be less grating now at maximum volume. One thing of note as well in the specs, which obviously we know is not going to tell you much, but officially Soundcore Motion Plus goes 50 Hz to 40 kilohertz. 40 kilohertz. I've talked about it in the past. I'm not going to say it again, other than saying. And the Soundcore Motion Boom goes 60 Hz to 20 kilohertz officially. So officially, the Motion Plus, as long as I got those specs right, which I believe I have, they're saying the Motion Plus goes deeper. We know that isn't true. It's a really weird thing they've done with those specs, but yeah, guys, just ignore that. It goes a lot deeper on the Motion Boom. Hope you got something out of this video, and I thank you for watching.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, cause I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life.